making an appearance at times.
Heading across to Wales, there'll be quite a thick blanket of cloud, giving the odd spot of drizzle over the hills. The Midlands will be mainly dry, although they'll have lost the early morning bright spells, being replaced by increasing amounts of miserable cloud and a bit of west to southwesterly breeze.
A little bit of patchy rain likely over the Pennines, but to the east of high ground, many parts of northeast England will be dry, albeit on the cloudy and rather breezy side.
For much of Scotland, the middle of the day will be unsettled with outbreaks of rain in places, quite strong winds. Edinburgh and some other eastern spots, though, should just about escape dry.
Northern Ireland, some rain likely to affect here, and it'll be light, it'll be patchy, it'll mainly fall over hills. It'll be mild with a keen wind blowing. The afternoon and evening will be mostly cloudy with patchy rain and strengthening winds. Gales and heavier rain will affect parts of the north, and that is how the weather is shaping up this Monday morning. GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. I'll be bringing you all the latest from Westminster today. That story about Carrie and Number 10 and meddling in affairs. What about also the NHS? And is Number 11 at war with Number 10? We'll also be talking about energy prices and what we could do to try and bring them down. And we're welcoming Hong Kongers fleeing the Chinese Communist Party coming to the UK. All that and more this morning, but first, it's your morning headlines.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:31. I'm Rosie Wright here to get you up to date on GB News. The Health Secretary says a plan to deal with the NHS backlog of hospital patient waiting lists in England is going to be published shortly. He'd rejected reports it had been put on hold because the Treasury refused to sign it off. Labour analysis revealed almost 300,000 people were unable to see a cancer specialist within 2 weeks of an urgent referral between April and November. The Health Secretary also says some recent criticism of the Prime Minister's wife, Carrie Johnson, was sexist, undignified and unfair. His statement follows publication of extracts from Lord Ashcroft's new book, which accuses Miss Johnson of influencing her husband's decision-making. Carrie Johnson has insisted she plays no role in government and has been targeted, she says, by enemies of the Prime Minister in a brutal briefing campaign. The Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, has been cleared of an allegation that he broke lockdown rules after he was filmed drinking a beer in an office. Durham police have confirmed they don't believe any offence was committed. International news now. The French President Emmanuel Macron is flying to Moscow today to meet the Russian president in a bid to dial down tension with Ukraine. Sources close to Macron said the French president's aiming to buy time to stall the situation until at least he hopes April, when several key European elections, including the French ones, are taking place. The capital of Canada has declared a state of emergency due to ongoing demonstrations against vaccine mandates that's been led by truckers. Well, they call themselves the Freedom Convoy. They've paralysed parts of the city for several days, with some saying they want to dissolve Canada's government. Students here will be able to get higher GCSE and A-level grades this year as the boundaries are set to be lowered. The Education Secretary, Nadeem Zahawi, says it will give students a fair chance following disruptions caused by the pandemic. You're now up to date here on GB News. Don't forget, we're on your TV, online and DAB Plus radio. I'll be keeping you up to date across the day. Now, though, back to the briefing with Tom.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, first of all today, Carrie Johnson said the Prime Minister's enemies are targeting her in what she described as a brutal briefing campaign, accusing her of meddling in the affairs of government, something she denies. On Sunday evening, the Prime Minister's wife issued a rare statement through her spokesperson in response to a new biography written by Tory peer Lord Ashcroft, serialised in newspapers over the weekend. Lord Ashcroft suggested her behaviour is preventing Boris Johnson from leading Britain as effectively as the voters deserve. Well, joining me to discuss this is Andrew Pearce, consulting editor of the Daily Mail. Of course, the Mail is where the book is being serialised. And let's talk about Carrie and influence, because it's not unusual for a Prime Minister's spouse to have a role in discussing issues of state, although potentially this is a more political spouse than we're used to.
Yeah, look, and nobody would ever think Cherie Blair had anything other than a lot to say behind the scenes. With Tony Blair, we know how involved she was in trying to get women MPs to support that ridiculous war he took us to in Iraq. Carrie Johnson is different, though, because before she married Boris Johnson, she was a political advisor to a cabinet minister, John Whittingdale. She also ran the Tory PR machine in Conservative Central Office for a couple of years. So she's a formidable political force in her own right. Therefore, she doesn't want to just be a wife in number 10. She wants to have some influence and some say, not unusual, but the Ashcroft book is saying it is disproportionate. So it says she got rid of a woman she didn't like because she was jealous of her, because she thought she was too attractive. Very serious charge to make. She is the key figure in the whole row about Wallpapergate. Your viewers recall all that. It cost, nearly £100,000 to decorate the flat where Carrie and Boris Johnson live. She took charge of all of that. Boris, like many men, dare I say, in a relationship, oh, you can do that, love. I'm not interested. He probably hasn't even noticed the wallpaper's changed, but she brought in the expensive interior designer. So she has created some of the messes he is now in. And the other charge I thought was really damaging in Ashcroft's book was the suggestion that she would pick up his phone and send text messages to various ministers and advisors. They would get the message from the Prime Minister's phone and assume it had come from the Prime Minister, and it was in fact from her.
Now, of course, these are things that she denies,
yes,
and strongly denies some of the accusations in the book. However, it does seem to me that we don't have this idea of what a Prime Minister's spouse should be in the United Kingdom. In the United States, it's very formalised. You have the role of the First Lady, who takes on a policy agenda of their own and pushes forward a campaign. Nancy Reagan on drugs, Melania Trump on online bullying, which I found to be a little bit ironic, perhaps, given her husband's Twitter account. But in this country, we don't have that formal structure, should we?
I think in a sense we should, but we would never want to call the Prime Minister's wife the First Lady, because with all respect, that's our Queen. Although, of course, when we have a king, that will change. But there have been role models, I think, for Prime Minister spouses. Dennis Thatcher was always around, one step behind the lady, but and although he could be a little bit indiscreet when he'd had a couple of gin and tonics, nobody ever thought Dennis Thatcher was involved in policy. Philip May, Theresa May's husband, all we knew about him was that he put the bins out in the morning, and that extraordinarily cringe-making interview when she also said she used to rush through the wheat fields when she was a child for a dare.
Girl jobs and boy jobs, if
absolutely,
I remember. Yeah.
Absolutely. So discretion has always been the rule. John Major's wife, Norma, was incredibly discreet. I would argue, actually, that Cherie Blair wasn't so discreet, but Carrie is defining this in her own way.
Is this one of the problems for Boris Johnson now? We're seeing people within the Parliamentary Conservative Party from all sides of the party, people on the left of the party, but also Brexiteers on the right of the party, saying that it's time for Boris Johnson to go. Is the problem for Boris Johnson that people who are on the Brexity right dislike Boris because of Carrie, and people who are on the Remainy left dislike Boris because of Brexit?
There might be a bit of that, but, you know, Tom, in a funny way, I think the fact his enemies are so dispersed across the party saves him, because against Theresa May, there was a Brexit party within the Tory party, and they moved against her, got rid of her, because they had an obvious champion to replace her, Boris Johnson. Now, there is no obvious successor. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, is definitely on manoeuvres, whatever that he likes to say. Is he the obvious alternative? He's the one who's leading this country into the highest tax burden for 70 years. He keeps trying to tell us it's not his national insurance rise. It is, Mr. Chancellor, because you brought it in your budget.
It always surprises me when people say that Rishi Sunak is somehow the Thatcherite candidate here, especially if we're talking about the two leading contenders being Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. It seems to me that Rishi Sunak would be the candidate of the left in that dichotomy.
And remember, when the national insurance rise was proposed in Cabinet, it was Liz Truss was one of the first to say, are you sure we shouldn't be raising taxes? We should find other ways to do it, perhaps through more borrowing, or hey, Tory government, reduce waste, maybe? That would be quite useful. And it was the Chancellor who said it had to be done. And that is not a Thatcherite view at all. She was the party of low tax, small state. Well, Rishi doesn't appear to be following that example.
Well, talking of potential waste and the Chancellor and the NHS, because this morning also we've seen a bit of alleged political interference from some quarters. There was meant to be this grand announcement of a huge plan to clear the backlog this morning in NHS provision. That hasn't come about. We've seen a very small slither of that plan announced, and accusations that the Treasury is blocking what Number 10 wants to do. Do you buy that?
I don't think this is all about the Chancellor trying to deny Boris some positive publicity, because people want to see the waiting list reduced. It's gone up to 6 million. It's going to go even higher because of the pandemic. I suspect, actually, the NHS is unreformed. It wastes billions of pounds a year, in my view, and I think the Chancellor is probably trying to ensure there's some financial discipline with how that's money spent, rather than trying to score points at Boris's expense. That's what I hope, anyway. It's
really interesting if we look at the NHS budget over the last 10 years or so. It's risen by around 40%. I think for people watching on TV, we can see this on our screens now. An enormous, tens of billions pounds more gone into the NHS budget since 2009, 2010. It's really quite extraordinary, the numbers and how they have risen. 40% more cash in it now than a decade ago. Is the Treasury not right, therefore, to say that we should be really careful before pumping yet more money in, that it's being spent in the right way?
I completely agree. I mean, I think the problem with when we've had huge influxes of cash into the NHS before, whether it was under Cameron or whoever, sometimes we discovered a lot of it went on extra wages. Now, of course, we want nurses to earn more money and doctors to earn more money, but what we really want is waiting lists to be cut. And I think if the Chancellor has put his foot down and he wants to ensure that money is going to be spent in the best possible way, so people who didn't have their cancer appointment or their hip operation or their knee operation, that's going to now happen. That would be good. So I'd be on the Chancellor's side in this position.
Well, it'll be really interesting to see the full detail of this plan. We're hearing it might come out later this week, although clearly some battles between Number 10 and Number 11 over this. Really
'Twas ever thus. 'Twas ever thus.
'Twas ever thus. Well, for now, Andrew Pearce, thank you very much for talking us through those issues this morning. A big political week. When do we not say that in 2022? Well, moving on to another big story, a story that affects us all in our pockets. What has gone wrong with energy in this country and across Europe? Regulator Ofgem announced an increase in the energy price cap, of course, last week, which will see millions of households pay on average £693 a year more. Of course, this is only catching up to the wholesale of price surge that has already bankrupted dozens of energy companies. And now the boss of British gas owner Centrica has warned that household bills could see a further increase in the autumn, on top of the 54% hike set to take place in April. Now, last week, of course, Rishi Sunak has announced a plan to offset some of the coming price hike by offering cash to help pay the bills. But will this really make a difference? Does it tackle the underlying issue? Frankly, this is a crisis of supply, and we do not have enough energy. We haven't produced enough of our own, and we know what happens with the laws of supply and demand. Well, let's talk through all of this now with the economist and wealth advisor Jonathan Davis. Welcome to the programme, Jonathan. It was a package of measures announced by the Chancellor last week that will go about half the way to make up the increase in prices. Is there a risk here that just dealing with that side of things rather than the supply side could actually be inflationary?
Well, politicians doing what politicians do, which is focus on the ultra short term and the polls rather than actually solving long-term problems. This has been building easily for 10 years. Politicians in the UK and across Europe have been talking green, 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 renewables, solar, wind, and pumping billions, tens of billions of our money into these wholly inefficient energy sources. So where we are now is that after 10 years of the oil and gas companies effectively not being allowed to find oil and gas and produce it, as you say, we have a problem of undersupply while we have rising demand, soaring indeed, for oil and gas. So when, for example, 2 years ago, oil was $20 a barrel, and it's now nearly $90 a barrel, and very similar for gas, well, of course, you're going to get huge price rises. And the politicians are pretending by handing money to people, although much of it is in the form of a loan rather than a grant, pretending that the problem isn't as big as it is. We have a current energy crisis, and I'm afraid to say it will only get worse.
This is an incredibly downbeat analysis. And of course, we know that many countries around the world have committed to move away from some of the dirtier fuels. We know that it's probably a good thing that we've moved away from coal in large part in this country. Should we not really go for something like nuclear power now to try and jivvy up the production capacity? Has oil not had its day?
There's a number of issues there. I would just proceed by saying at COP26 at my original hometown of Glasgow, Johnson and his cronies came out as the most green politicians on the planet. Well, that's great, because their millionaire and billionaire mates can afford high costs of energy, but the bottom 95% are finding it in crisis. So oil certainly has not had its day. On the contrary, it will take decades, literally, to move from oil and gas and coal to renewables, which is what the political elite and the globalists want to happen. Decades. I'll be amazed if they can even achieve it before 2050, which is even then unlikely. And then your other point is nuclear. I'm a massive supporter of nuclear energy. And of course, it's the most efficient producer of energy. It's the cleanest energy on the planet. And yet the politicians don't like it. Well, on that point, interestingly, European countries have got it even worse energy-wise than we do, believe it or not. And it's very interesting that literally in the last couple of weeks, after many years of the European Union, the European Commission saying nuclear is bad, nuclear is dreadful, all of a sudden, with the price of their energy going through the roof and then going cap in hand to Vladimir Putin saying, please continue to send us your gas and your oil, all of a sudden, the European Commission is finally saying, do you know what? Nuclear isn't so bad after all. And that actually is a move that's coming across the planet. And eventually, finally, we'll get the politicians saying, do you know what? We'll need to build more nuclear power stations. The problem is it takes a minimum of 10 or 15 years for them to come online.
Well, it woe betide me to praise France. But France, over the last few decades, really went for nuclear and seems to have had a much better time of it. Whereas Germany shutting down its nuclear power stations, what a sorry state of affairs. Well, Jonathan Davies, thank you for joining us this morning. Good to go through those issues, and even though it might be slightly depressing for people. Well, now I want to highlight something that is being missed by many in this energy discussion. It's true that this is not solely a British problem. It affects many countries around the world. There are no quick fixes to supply constraint and higher demand. This being said, the global gas price crisis isn't as global as some would make out. Let's take a look at the natural gas prices in Europe, East Asia, and the United States of America. Now, for those listening on radio, I'm showing a graph from The Economist magazine that is really quite astounding and worth looking up on GB News social media after the show. It shows soaring prices in Europe and East Asia over the last 18 months, and prices in the USA flatlining. Well, what's going on? Well, this is all thanks to long-term US energy policy, particularly that country's enormous expansion in natural gas production since the late 2000s. They got fracking. They used hydraulic fracturing to put two fingers up to Vladimir Putin and create their own stable supply of domestic energy. And what foresight that's turned out to be. Because natural gas is cleaner than coal. The boost in production actually helped reduce CO2 emissions as well as generate energy security. It insulated their country from supply shocks that they were all too used to and too vulnerable to in the 1970s with Middle Eastern instability and oil price shocks. Well, gas production in the USA rose by around 50% between 2007 and 2017. An astronomical surge. It provided security, CO2 reduction, and price falls. How much did prices fall thanks to this wise policy? A policy that did not cost taxpayers a single penny, I should add. Well, between 2007 and 2017, there was around a 50% drop in the price of natural gas in the US. A 50% drop. The spot price of natural gas halved. Whereas in the UK, we pathetically pursued a moratorium on fracking. Despite sitting on a wealth of natural resources, we chose to abandon them, chose artificially higher prices, chose to force people to make that horrible choice between heating and eating, chose to be beholden to the whims of Mr. Putin. What a sorry, predictable, and entirely avoidable state of affairs. Now, the Welcoming Committee for Hong Kongers is an independent group for all those who care about the integration of new arrivals from Hong Kong. They hosted a new launch event a few days ago. Let's take a look.
We're here together this evening in Public Hall to formally launch the Welcoming Committee for Hong Kongers, bringing everybody together, those who are welcoming Hong Kongers to this country and those who are being welcomed. Welcome.
It was one of the most extraordinary, momentous decisions made by any government for a long time.
This country really stands for freedom, really, tolerance within a framework and a rule of law. And I think it's massively wonderful to have those 90,000 come, but hopefully many hundreds of thousands more. And it's important to have a welcoming committee for Hong Kongers.
It was a very tough decision, and a daunting task to try and settle into a new country. But fortunately, the people I've met here from all walks of life and cultural backgrounds have all been very welcoming and friendly.
Now, of course, admirably, the UK government opened up a refugee programme of sorts for British national overseas passport holders to come to the United Kingdom, fleeing the tyranny of the Chinese Communist Party as it swept over Hong Kong, ending the one country, two systems agreement, in effect, that was agreed between the United Kingdom and China when that part was handed over back to China. Well, sadly, the situation has deteriorated, but the Welcoming Committee for Hong Kongers in the UK is helping people make a new life, fleeing communism to a free country. I'm delighted to discuss what's going on with the Welcoming Committee for Hong Kongers now with Daniel Korski, who is chair of the committee. Daniel, welcome to the programme. First of all, we've seen 90,000 people come. How are they finding life in the UK?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me on to the program. The great news is that most people are finding life, very comfortable and are integrating easily. People who are coming here, we now know from a recent survey conducted, are predominantly professionals. They have advanced degrees. They come with children, but are really keen to work. So we're dealing with a cohort of people who are really keen to integrate into British society, to really contribute in the best way they can, starting, of course, in the labour market. And what we see, because there are, of course, pre-existing communities here, people tend to gravitate towards the places where they have friends or have heard of, or even relatives. So you have a number of places, for example, Sutton in London, where lots of Hong Kongers have gone. But the real challenge now, as numbers rise, as you say, from that 90,000 cohort that has already arrived up to potentially 250,000, to ensure that that Hong Kongers see the benefit of living in lots of places across the United Kingdom, not just where Hong Kongers have settled until now.
So when you're doing, when you're reaching out to these communities, what sort of work are you doing, and how easy is it really to encourage people to spread out and to integrate into British life? I noted that in Hong Kong, many groups were flying British flags as flags of freedom against the tyranny of the CCP, which is a really quite heartwarming thing. Speaking to a lot of people in this country, you wouldn't necessarily think that the UK flag would be flown by people who are proud of what it stands for in other parts of the world, but that seemed to be happening. It seems like Hong Kongers are people who will integrate easily and integrate well.
I think you're making a wonderful point, which is the fact that from Ukraine to Hong Kong, the British flag is now seen as a real beacon of freedom. And it's particularly true for Hong Kongers coming here. The first wave of people coming, you'd not be surprised to hear, have been people who have been on the forefront of the barricades, often younger students, those who feel particularly targeted by the Communist Party. But what we're also seeing now as the numbers swell are people who haven't necessarily been at the forefront of the political protests, families, working parents, those who may sympathize with the street protests, but themselves have not necessarily been involved. But what they do see and what they realize is that there's no future for them and their family, their children in Hong Kong as Hong Kong is integrated further into China proper. And so they're coming. And the reason it's important to highlight that is that means there are lots of different needs. The people who are coming straight from the barricades with an arrest warrant issued against them, who often want to kind of continue the struggle in Hong Kong, but from somewhere else like the UK, have very different needs, requirements, expectations than those who might be coming for a slightly quieter and safer life. So what's so important going forward now, as I say, when we go from 90,000 to potentially 350,000, is to help people in all manners and ways to help them into education if they need to ensure that their qualifications, many of whom arrive with pre-existing qualifications, to ensure that they're recognized. We have lots of people with experience from the health service, just at a time when our health service needs people to join. So we have to ensure that doctors, nurses, and so on can easily integrate.
Just finally, Daniel, we've only got 30 seconds left, but could you just explain what we can do, what anyone watching here can do to help integrate, to help welcome these people who have been fleeing communism and want to make their lives in a free Britain?
It's a great question. If people come to your community, reach out. If children rock up in your school, reach out to their parents, show the sort of welcoming that we have shown to so many people that makes integration so successful, and ultimately this country so successful. So when you see people, whether at work, in your schools, in your local community, make that extra effort, reach out, suggest a cup of tea, and for ways in which you can help them understand what life in the UK is all about.
What a fantastically British way to welcome people in, with a cup of tea, and particularly to welcome people fleeing communism in. These are exactly the kind of people we need to be welcoming to the United Kingdom. Daniel, thank you for joining us on The Briefing this morning. I'm afraid that's it for the programme. Coming up, it's To The Point with Mercy Muroki and me. I'm standing in for Patrick Christie's as he's on holiday. That's coming up after the weather.
Looking ahead to today's weather, and Britain is looking increasingly cloudy after a sunny and frosty start with some rain arriving. The details: the southwest of England will end the morning on a generally dry but cloudier note than you'll see first thing, and a slight breeze will also develop. Some cloud will also be edging in across the southeast, although here the sun will still be making an appearance at times.
Heading across to Wales, there'll be quite a thick blanket of cloud, giving the odd spot of drizzle over the hills. The Midlands will be mainly dry, although they'll have lost the early morning bright spells, being replaced by increasing amounts of miserable cloud and a bit of west to southwesterly breeze.
A little bit of patchy rain likely over the Pennines, but to the east of high ground, many parts of northeast England will be dry, albeit